Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are going to decode a pretty radical and honestly fascinating shift in how India secures its borders. Now, when we think of border security, our minds almost automatically go to missiles, tanks, and armed patrols, right? But today, we actually aren't talking about weapons. We're talking about people. We're diving into a completely new geopolitical playbook that is focused entirely on civilian populations. So, let's get right into it.
So picture this, 4,800 crores. That is a massive central government investment, and it acts as the financial backbone of what's called the Vibrant Villages program. The primary goal of all that money is actually incredibly specific. It's to stop the out-migration of citizens who are living in these super remote villages along the line of actual control, or LAC, with China. But to really understand why keeping everyday civilians in these extreme, remote locations is suddenly worth thousands of crores, we need to take a step back and look at the big picture.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. A radical border strategy. 2. The history of empty borders. 3. Strategic counterplay. 4. Brutal terrain. And finally, 5. Memory triggers.
All right, Section 1, a radical border strategy.
This initiative isn't just some quiet, under-the-radar policy change. It was officially and very publicly launched by the Home Minister in Kibitho, which is this really remote village in Arunachal Pradesh. It represents a complete paradigm shift in national security. Basically, at its core, the Vibrant Villages program is a centrally sponsored scheme aimed at completely revamping both the infrastructure and the economy of these remote settlements located right along the line of actual control. And it's a massive team effort. The stakeholders here aren't just military brass. We're talking about the Ministry of Home Affairs, various border state governments, and the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. They are all working together to pull this off.
Moving on to Section 2, History of Empty Borders.
Now, you might be wondering, why is this massive development happening only now? Well, to understand the Vibrant Villages program, we really have to look at a deeply counterintuitive military doctrine that actually guided planners for decades. It all traces back to the aftermath of the 1962 war. Historically, military planners believed that building high-quality, all-weather roads all the way up to the border was a huge strategic liability. The fear was that if the Chinese army were to invade, well-paved Indian roads would literally just help the enemy advance faster into Indian territory. So as a direct result of that defensive mindset, which evolved into this empty border strategy in the 1990s, these border villages were deliberately left undeveloped. No proper roads, no electricity, no schools. It honestly wasn't until 2023 that we saw the launch of the Vibrant Villages program to finally reverse that decades-old mindset.
The result of that old strategy? Well, because Indian villages lacked basic amenities, the locals were packing up and migrating to cities in search of a better life. This left the Indian side of the border practically deserted. But meanwhile, over on the other side of the LAC, China initiated a strategy of building what they call Xiaokang, which translates to moderately prosperous villages. China was rapidly constructing hundreds of these highly developed civilian settlements right up against the border. And here is the kicker. These are dual-use military-civilian villages. They were effectively using their own citizens to assert territorial claims right up against an empty Indian border.
Which brings us to a critical geopolitical concept that you absolutely need to know: salami slicing. By leaving the borders empty, while Chinese citizens moved right up to the LAC, India's border became incredibly vulnerable to this tactic. Salami slicing is basically creeping, incremental, territorial encroachment. It's the act of slowly slicing away territory, piece by tiny piece, without ever doing quite enough at one single time to provoke a full-scale war. And an empty, unmonitored border? That is literally the perfect environment for salami slicing to succeed.
Let's dive into Section 3. India's strategic counterplay. From a global perspective, using civilian settlements as a geopolitical tool is a classic tactic. We've seen it used extensively in places like the South China Sea and the West Bank. But now, with a 4,800 crore counteroffensive, India is finally matching China's gray zone tactics on the land border. So how exactly does throwing money at remote villages translate to national security? Well, there are 3 strategic pillars to this counterplay. Step 1 is establishing the first line of defense. Step 2 is asserting sovereignty, and Step 3 is creating dual-use infrastructure. Let's unpack each of these, because they perfectly explain the logic of this new doctrine. A populated border is a secure border.
Let's break down Step 1. The absolutely crucial point here is human, or human intelligence. When a border is populated, local shepherds and villagers basically act as the permanent eyes and ears for the military. Look, technology and satellites are great, for sure. But locals who know every single rock, tree, and stream, they provide absolutely critical intelligence regarding unusual Chinese troop movements or border incursions way before satellites in space ever pick them up. You simply cannot replace that kind of human intelligence on the ground. Moving right into step 2, we look at the legal and diplomatic angle. Under international law, continuous civilian habitation is a massive, undeniable tool for asserting territorial claims. By stopping outmigration and actually encouraging things like niche tourism and local handicrafts, the government ensures these areas become economically self-sustaining. This permanently anchors the population to the border, which firmly cements India's sovereign control over disputed regions, particularly in sensitive places like Arunachal Pradesh.
And step 3 is where the economics and the military logistics perfectly align. Dual-use infrastructure. The assets being built under this scheme, the high-quality all-weather roads, the 4G telecom towers, the helipads, they are ostensibly for civilian use. They are meant to bring these villages into the 21st century, but they are entirely dual-use. Meaning, in the event of an armed conflict, the Indian military can immediately commandeer that exact civilian infrastructure to rapidly deploy troops and heavy supplies straight to the front lines.
Okay, Section 4, Brutal Terrain and Challenges.
Now, strategy on paper is very different from strategy in practice, right? 15,000 feet. We are not just talking about paving a road in a flat valley. Engineers are expected to build high-grade, all-weather roads and lay fragile optic fiber cables for 4G networks at staggering altitudes of 15,000 feet and above. The sheer physiological and mechanical strain of just existing at this altitude makes every single day of construction a brutal uphill battle.
And you know what? The altitude isn't even the hardest part. It's the time limit. The logistics are extreme because the working season in these regions is just brutally short. Engineers only get a few months to blast rock, pour concrete, and lay fiber before heavy snows fall and completely block access to the entire region. Executing this hub-and-spoke development model in such a tiny, snow-free window, it requires nothing short of a logistical miracle, year after year.
Finally, Section 5, High Retention Memory Triggers.
Let's quickly grasp the sheer scale of the future outlook here. Phase 1 of this program alone is targeting nearly 3,000 remote villages. That's a massive net spanning across 4 states and 1 union territory along the northern border. Ultimately, the true innovation to take away from all this is the deliberate integration of national security with local economic self-sustainability.
So if you're tracking this geopolitically, these are the concepts to lock in. When you think of the Chinese strategy on the border, the key word is Xiaokang villages. When you think of the primary Indian objective right now, it's stopping outmigration. And the key geopolitical tactics enabling this new secure border? That would be dual-use infrastructure and human intelligence.
We've seen exactly why these villages need to be built, and we've seen the brutal conditions standing in the way. Which leaves us with one massive, lingering question. Who on earth is actually going to pull off this logistical miracle? I mean, who possesses the engineering capability to carve dual-use, all-weather roads out of solid rock at 15,000 feet before the snows hit? Well, that monumental task falls to a very specific group, and they are the vital next piece of this geopolitical puzzle. But we're going to have to explore the Border Roads Organization in our next deep dive. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.